Cool, just got that. Can you guys see the fact that I have the icons down right now?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So that means I'm not going to be able to monitor the chat as much.
Okay, good to know. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. I'm Virginia Duplessis from Futures Without Violence, and today's session is on racism, domestic violence, and Black maternal mortality, specifically what advocates can do to help. Today's webinar is co-sponsored by UJIMA Incorporated, the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black Community, and Futures Without Violence. So as many of you have probably seen in the news, the past couple years, there's been a lot of attention on the impact of racism on Black birthing people and health disparities. And we've known for a long time that, unfortunately, intimate partner violence has a disproportionate impact on Black women. What we haven't looked at as much as is how these three issues intersect. And so today, that's what we're going to focus on. So let's take a look at our learning objectives. We've got an hour and a half together, and hopefully after our time together, you'll be better able to understand, again, this intersection of racism, domestic violence, and poor maternal health outcomes for Black birthing people. You'll be better able to define the role and scope of doulas and midwives, and we've got some fabulous speakers here today to speak to that specifically. And then really importantly, thinking about how you can take this information back to your programs. So building the capacity to partner effectively with doulas and midwives. And then in kind of the big picture, more systemic level, really think about those policy opportunities to improve systems of care for Black birthing people. So as I mentioned, we've got a great slate of speakers today. They'll be introducing themselves, but just to give you a little bit of a preview, we have Megan Simmons, who's at UJIMA Incorporated, who's a senior policy attorney who will give us some context to the issue. We have Malika Hook Muhammad, the DC doula, who will be talking about the scope and role of doulas. We have Jessica Diggs, who's a midwife and educator, and also a doula, who's going to talk about her role. And then I'm, again, Virginia Duplessis from Futures Without Violence. I'll be talking a little bit about partnerships and also sharing some national resources. And you'll also have an opportunity as participants to share with us. We really want this to be a dialogue where we're all sharing what we know. So we're going to do a quick little poll just to see where people are in talking about these issues. So if you can click on whichever, all that are appropriate, which providers you're familiar with. Doulas, midwives, both, or neither. So we're going to give it just a couple seconds for people to vote. And sometimes there's confusion about the role of midwives and doulas, which is specifically why we wanted to have both of those types of providers on today to talk about how they intersect and how they're also different. So Whitney, do you want to share what we found? Oh, Whitney, you might be muted.
I am. I'm doing a lot of clicking over here. So we have found that of the people who were polled on our webinar, 33% are familiar with midwives, 7% are familiar with doulas, 57% are familiar with both, and 23% are familiar with neither.
Okay, great. So a pretty big range here. Thanks so much. All right. So we're going to close the poll and move into our next section. So we're going to hand it over to Megan, who's going to give us some context on the issue.
Good afternoon, folks, and good morning to some folks. My name is Megan Simmons. I am a senior policy attorney at UJIMA Inc., which is the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black Community. We are based out of DC, and we are so happy to work with Futures as well as Ms. Jessica and Ms. Muhammad on this presentation. I'm going to go over just a few things regarding some historical practices as well as imagery and the like, and then we will transition into some of the information regarding policy and provider care. Thanks. Like I said before, we're going to discuss a little bit about imagery as well as some of the assumptions that are made. You can see just some stereotypical photographs and things that kind of impact people's perceptions and imagery of Black women. They can impact the way that the medical community as well as others interact with Black women. You'll see an example of what some folks would call the angry Black woman. It basically shifts the blame from institutional racism and the like to that woman. The strong Black woman is often stereotypically thought of or described as someone that can endure anything, lends itself to some of the stereotypes that we will talk about later on, or assumptions about Black women and pain. And they can always move forward with things and don't feel pain in the same way that in the same way that others can. Mammy is one that a lot of people are pretty familiar with. Her image is often has been seen throughout history as well as publications and the like. She internalizes her oppression and is often seen as docile. And then Jezebel. Again, this is just a few of them, but just to give you some context to some of the things that folks see when they make assumptions about Black women, Black women's health, and their interaction with Black women. The objectification of the Black female or the Black female body. Here, most notably, is Miss Sarah Bartman. She was used as a showpiece for money in England as well as Ireland, and she was also experimented upon and sexually assaulted. Slide. Thanks so much. Just a little bit about Black women and Black women's pain. I talked about it a little bit before already, but many doctors have been taught throughout history that Black women can tolerate pain more than others, or that Black people can tolerate pain more than others. This is still a part of the narrative in many medical communities within the United States. According to a study conducted by the American Journal of Emergency Medicine, Black people are given less pain medication than other demographics and have to make more requests for pain medication than others. Expectant mothers are not exempt from this. One woman explained that she was back and forth to medical facilities for 3 days before it was eventually discovered that she was actually in labor. Folks, just to let you know, we are putting some of this information, studies, articles, and the like in the slides. In the event you decide you want to move after the call or after the webinar, you'd like to review some of the information. Just pointing that out to folks. Slide. Thank you. The Black community has a storied past with doctors in the medical community, and sometimes a mistrust. The Ruff sisters who were sterilized, their mothers signed for a procedure, and they essentially thought that they were going to be provided with birth control, but in actuality, they were sterilized. And this was actually a practice that was funded by the government for many years. Dr. Marion Sims, can you slide it back? Thank you. Dr. Marion Sims experimented on Black women without anesthesia. He's notable and has been used in medical studies, and shared his information and research has been shared for many years. He is a very well-known gynecologist. The women that he experimented on were Black slaves and were rented, quote, for experimental purposes. Experiments were performed on their sexual parts, and these experiments were sometimes performed in front of an audience. Also, excuse me, also, the Tuskegee experiment is, again, another situation wherein Black men were just experimented upon without their knowledge or any type of informed consent. So there's often a lot of questioning or concern as it relates to trusting doctors, trusting the medical community, making sure that people are actually getting the care in which they believe that they're getting at that time. Slide. Thank you. There's been a long tradition of midwives and doulas that predates the enslavement of Black people in the United States. It actually dates back to Africa. Black women delivered babies, served as postpartum doulas, and provided breastfeeding counseling in Africa while enslaved. And these services were provided to enslaved women as well as women that enslaved these women. I noted a few of notable midwives here. Miss Mary Cooley cared for women in Georgia and provided midwifery services and perinatal services to family of all races. She's featured in a documentary called All My Babies. Miss Maud Collin, she practiced midwifery in Berkeley County, South Carolina, which is my home. She had her own practice and trained midwives. Her duties included vaccinations and exams, as well as records on teeth and eyes. That is a very rural, at that time, it was a very rural community, and there were not hospitals very close for folks to get out to. And then there is Miss Mary Hale Garland. She served as a midwife and consultant and trainer in Arkansas, and she's credited with significantly helping to decrease maternal mortality, as well as contributing to midwifery regulation. Slide. Thank you. So African American women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die during delivery than their white counterparts. Doulas and midwives can reduce and contribute to the reduction of this kind of maternal mortality, and we have seen that not only now but in the past, as I just discussed those 3 notable midwives. Studies have shown that midwives and doulas help reduce, again, these fatalities in pregnant women. We've already discussed, like I said, these folks that have made these contributions. Some of the things that they can contribute are the ability to provide more extensive postpartum services. These kinds of services should be provided to all women, but in particularly those women that are seeing such high numbers in their rates of mortality. Slide. Thank you. Representation matters. My hope is that through this presentation, I at least impart upon you that birth work is not new, particularly in the Black community, and that it would be helpful, if not pivotal, that we continue to encourage this kind of work. Currently, Black and brown women are not typically the face of birth work generally, although this is a very problematic concern within the Black community. I think exposure to the field and public awareness that it is a viable profession, licensure requirements and regulations have created barriers. It would be great to see some of those barriers subside so more folks can get into this particular profession and make a living wage advocacy again around wages that are suitable for this kind of work, and then policy to increase representation would also be helpful. Slide. Thank you. And that kind of transitions me to my last slide. Excuse me. There are some policy recommendations provided by Black Women's Blueprint, which is a wonderful study that they did. It was created by Black Women's Blueprint and discusses the links between sexual assault, reproductive health, and maternal mortality. Among many other things, the report provided several policy recommendations. More transparency is needed. The expansion of Preventing Maternal Deaths Act, a data warehouse that considers the effect of trauma on gender-based violence and maternal outcomes, and confidential case reporting for pregnancy-related deaths. Slide.
Thanks so much, Megan. I'll take over. I am Malika Hook Muhammad, also known as the DC Doula. I am a birth and postpartum doula here in the DC metro area. We can move forward to the next slide. I want to talk with you a bit about doula practice and the scope of doula practice. For those of you who aren't familiar, I want to make sure that you become familiar with doulas. And for those who are already familiar, maybe I'll expand a bit upon what you already know. So doula work is not new. For as long as humans have been birthing babies, there have been others who supported and cared for those people. If you look at ancient birth art, you'll always see a birthing person surrounded by 2 or 3 other people, and those are usually a midwife, a doula, and if there's a third person, it's usually a midwife's assistant or a baby's nurse. We'll go deeper into what exactly doula practice looks like in a second, but in a nutshell, doulas are non-medical labor support and postpartum helpers. They are singularly focused on the person in labor and provide continuous support in labor and intermittent support in the postpartum period. Excuse me. A doula's primary responsibility is to the birthing person, not to a policymaker, not to a hospital administrator, a nurse, midwife, or doctor. But this is what is particularly special about the doula's role. They're often the only person on the birthing team that is singularly focused on the person in labor. At this time, there's no license needed to become a doula. There are, however, several training and certification programs. And if you're someone who's interested in becoming a doula, it's best to do your research to find out what training programs really resonate with your personal ideology. Next slide, please. So what do doulas do? The doula scope is pretty widespread. The doula's work begins prenatally, depending on the model of care that you are working under. A lot of doulas are able to meet with clients prenatally. Sometimes you meet a client when they go into labor. But we provide health education and healthcare navigation to support. And this helps to keep the birthing person and their partner informed about what's going on during the pregnancy and throughout the course of labor. The doula's job is to stay informed about the most up-to-date evidence-based information about birth options so they can provide balanced and well-informed support and information to their clients. Most people think about doulas, they think about back rubs and hip squeezes, and physical support is definitely an important aspect of what doulas do. Physical support can help to dissipate anxiety in labor and maintain a sense of control for the birthing person, as well as comfort and confidence in their ability to birth their babies. Physical support can dissipate the intensity of the birthing sensations that are felt by birthing people, which also helps them to navigate their course of labor a bit more easily. The doula's role is never to replace partners or loved ones or other people who are supporting the person in labor. Instead, we work collaboratively to enhance their experience throughout that process. Doulas guide and educate partners and other loved ones on how to provide effective physical support and verbal comfort during labor. Doulas are also there to fill in gaps. So when the partner reaches the limits of their comfort zone, because maybe they've never experienced birth before, the doula can step in and the birthing person continues to receive seamless support. So the loved ones and partner of the person in labor can stay safely in their comfort zone and also enjoy the process of watching this new baby being born into their families. Very often in labor, two sets of hands are better than one, and the doula becomes the teammate and ally of all others who have shown up to support the person in labor. The doula creates a sense of alliance in the birth space, working with and uniting everybody on the team. This helps birthing people to feel cared for and encourages a sense of empowerment before and during and after birth. We help to facilitate emotional support, which includes validation, reassurance, normalizing of the experience, making sure the birthing person feels heard, teaching the birthing person and their partner and other supportive loved ones what positive communication looks like in the birth space. And there's something about birth that imprints on people. So doulas are protectors of birth memories. By caring for the emotional health of the person in labor, doulas enhance that person's ability to solidify positive birth memories. We're cultural brokers as well. We help to improve communication between marginalized people and their healthcare providers. Doulas can mitigate the effects of social determinants of health by addressing health literacy and providing social supports. So doulas can eliminate gaps in communication so that everyone walks away with a full understanding of what is being planned. For example, if I'm supporting a family where English is their second language, or English is perceived to be their second language because of how they look. Or maybe I'm supporting someone who views their provider as an authority figure that should not be questioned. We never want people to walk away feeling unheard or uninformed when they are meeting with their care providers. So the doula can help to prompt questions or to even translate what the information that has been given to the person in labor. Advocacy in birth work can look lots of different ways. It can look like helping a birthing person find their voice and to claim autonomy over their health care. Sometimes it means amplifying the birthing person's voice, and other times it means re-educating or introducing new perspectives to healthcare providers and legislators who may have lost sight of what's best for the individual person that's right in front of them. Next slide, please. So depending on the model of care, a lot of work is done prenatally, as I already mentioned. Unfortunately, in this society, most people with female anatomy don't begin learning about their reproductive systems until they're either trying to get pregnant or preparing to birth a baby. So in that time, people are preparing to birth. They often get a crash course in their own anatomy, which, as you can imagine, causes anxiety or sometimes fear about all that there is for them to learn. And depending on their history with trauma and their relationship to their bodies, these can be very murky waters. So doulas work to bridge knowledge gaps and provide education to help address fears so that birthing people can take ownership of their birthing choices. I like to make sure all of my clients feel fully informed and empowered as they're approaching birth. It's estimated that 1/3 of birthing individuals describes their births as traumatic. And 1 in 10 parents begin their journey as parents with PTSD. Trauma has a profound impact on health and the well-being of families and communities. So working with doulas can help to mitigate that a bit. Birthing after a traumatic experience is also fraught with challenges for individuals who might be anxious about repeating those previous experiences. The choices that they make for their subsequent births could often be varied and diverse, and doulas can help them to explain the choices that are, to understand the choices that are ahead of them, so that they're making choices from an informed perspective and not from fear. So in prenatal sessions, they may reflect on strategies that can promote post-traumatic growth and how clients can effectively prepare for birth with confidence. Next slide, please. Doulas can help birthing people to create a safe environment during labor and in birth, and there are many ways that this can happen. Doulas are protectors of the birth environment, as I already mentioned. We help birthing people to find their inner peace, as well as peace with the circumstances that are in front of them. We like to think about, a lot of people like to think about birth as this ultra Zen experience, but sometimes it's not. And a doula can help you to navigate those difficult pieces if they should arise during your experience. A lot of the hippies will say it's the energy that gets the baby in that gets the baby out. So doulas can help to create an environment that facilitates the production of those kinds of hormones, whether you're birthing at home, in a birth center, or in a hospital setting. It happens with very simple things like the lighting or familiar music, holding space for silence, signage on doors at hospital rooms that inform staff about birthing preferences so that when they come into the room, they're not asking questions or offering things that may bring the birthing person out of the sense of empowerment and peace that they've created for themselves. Emotions play a very strong role in driving the hormones of labor. So in recognizing that hormones can sometimes block or slow labor should they be interrupted in the way that they're produced, doulas can encourage birthing people to consider questions like, what's going through your mind with that last contraction? That one seemed different from the ones before. Are you considering something that you weren't considering before? None of these issues or these questions don't need to be answered in labor. The doula can ask the question and leave the birthing person to kind of explore that within themselves. And oftentimes they come to their own reconciliation with whatever that is without a lot of conversation. Because for those of you who have had babies, you know that when in labor, that is not the time to have deep, in-depth conversations. As birth advocates, doulas facilitate positive communication between providers and clients, helping both partners and providers address and consider the birthing person's fears. Positive communication is key to assuring that the birthing person is honored and respected. With good support and communication, birthing people can participate in decision-making, a process which has shown to contribute to a positive experience and positive memories of birth. While care providers may be heavily focused on the biological safety of the parent and the child, the doula can complement this care by providing sustained recognition that labor and birth constitute a significant life experience that people are going through that needs to be remembered in detail for the rest of their lives. Next slide, please. And then there's so much energy that goes into preparing for birth that oftentimes the postpartum period is forgotten or not planned for. So doulas can help people to consider this so that they're setting themselves up for success in the postpartum period. The postpartum period is when birthing people are particularly vulnerable. There's physical healing that is happening as well as emotional healing. We live in a society that is so heavily insistent on us being productive that deference is seldom given to the postpartum healing time. The postpartum period should be a time of stillness, and there are a number of cultures across the world that have postpartum healing and resting practices that include rests of at least 40 days. Doulas can help to create that space for their clients. We also engage in storytelling about birth. There's a haze that people go into when they're in labor that sometimes prevents them from solidifying some of those memories. So by using storytelling postpartum, they can reflect on what they remember, and the doulas can reflect on what they remember and help to build positive birth memories, sometimes correcting misunderstandings that happened during the process of labor, and then sometimes addressing traumas that have occurred. Lots of education happens in the postpartum period as well. How do you care for your new body after you've grown this baby, birthed this baby, and now what? Doulas can help to educate people about what to expect and normalize all of the strange things that happen to the body in the postpartum period. Doulas can also help with trauma recovery and holding space, connecting to resources, and just listening when people need to express and explore traumas that they encountered during birth. Next slide, please. So in public health, racism influences social determinants of health. As Megan already mentioned, Black women are 3 times more likely to have poor outcomes in birth than our white counterparts. Access to doulas benefits everyone in that everyone working with a doula can feel that their birthing choices are validated, their labors are shortened, they have the decreased need to use analgesia in labor, so pain medication. There are fewer operative deliveries and less C-sections. There's an increased parental satisfaction and a decrease in postpartum depression and anxiety. But specifically for marginalized communities, working with doulas can labor rates of preterm births. They can decrease rates of low birth weight babies. They can decrease infant mortality rates and decrease incidences of maternal and parental mortality during the labor process. Reducing C-sections also means that we're reducing maternal morbidity in initial and in future pregnancies. So we're setting people up for healthcare success in all of their subsequent pregnancies. Next slide. And I'll hand it over to you.
Hi, this is Jessica Diggs. I'm a midwife and educator in Los Angeles. And I'll be sharing more about the midwifery scope of practice and how it can contribute to improving birth outcomes for all people. So again, both Megan and Malika have spoke extensively about the disparities in healthcare. So I'm just going to briefly touch on that and then segue into how midwifery care plays a part in alleviating some of this. So we know systemic racism, lack of representation, inadequate cultural awareness training really contribute significantly to disparities in healthcare and specifically our embarrassing maternal mortality rates in this country, specifically for Black women and Black birthing people. So we see it in increased usage of interventions during labor, often without an understanding of why those interventions are necessary. We see it from a disregard of their pain and inadequate pain management. I'm sure you can survey your friends and families and see how many of them can report that the epidural did not work and someone did not address that throughout their labor. I know so many stories of that instance. And we see it in lack of support and in lower breastfeeding rates beyond the birth, but into the postpartum period, and how our Black birthing people are not getting access to often available lactation consultant within the same hospital as their white counterparts, but they don't come in to their hospital room because they assume that they aren't going to breastfeed because they're Black, or they just hand them a WIC brochure. So we have so many stories of Black birthing people and their experiences in these settings and just not getting adequate care. In addition to all of what Malika and Megan has already said, we know that just barriers in schooling and availability to training for Black providers, midwives, and doulas have contributed to just lack of representation in this field. We also know that these rates currently, the disparities I mean, are there because doulas and midwives, even access to us is often cost prohibitive for many people. And then insurance is not covering the cost. So that is contributing also to these disparities. And as we talk through policy recommendations and changes, we hope to address those things. Next slide, thank you. So for midwifery care, most people know of doulas, most people know of midwives, so just want to clear the air. We are not the same thing. We often collaborate well together. I love working with doulas, but as a midwife, I am a medical provider, and as Malika said, doulas are not medical providers. So as a midwife, I specialize in low-risk physiological reproductive health that is from puberty and adolescence to menopause. I can do pap smears, I can draw blood, I can do your annual breast exam, and I can deliver a baby, with everything being under the scope of low risk. So if you have some condition that will need a higher level of care, whether it's at birth or in the postpartum period, then it might be best that you do give birth with an obstetrician. But if everything is fairly normal, then a midwife is a fair option for all of your reproductive care. The role of a midwife is to provide comprehensive and holistic care. So not only am I going to be asking about your pregnancies, I'm going to be asking about your emotional state, your relationship, your work environment, your stress levels, your nutrition. I want to get a big picture of your whole life, because we know that all aspects of our life contribute extensively to our reproductive experience, from menstruation, but also significantly to our pregnancies and our birthing experience. So for me as a midwife, it is really important to gather a sense of your whole self, mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical well-being. Midwives are compassionate healthcare providers with exceptional interpersonal skills. We easily build rapport with clients. They become friends. We go to baby showers, baptisms, all the things, because we actually take the time to get to know each client as an individual person. And so we have skills to really push past just the medical care, but get to know this person, where we can speak into their lives, speak into the hardships that they come up against in labor, and be able to see them as a full person to give them the best, safest outcome. So we are really good at getting to know everybody, including family members and your other children. Siblings are some of my favorite people at birth. And this will play a huge part in how midwifery care plays in understanding the signs and dynamics of interpersonal violence, as we talk more about that. Additionally, midwives are clinically trained in life-saving techniques. Often people don't realize our scope of practice, and that in California, where I'm based, I am licensed by the same medical board as all OBs, and they have no idea that my licensure includes neonatal resuscitation. I can administer life-saving Pitocin so that the birthing person doesn't bleed too much at birth. I can keep baby safe. All the first line defense things offered at a hospital, I have access to and can do at home, in a chic, offering in a chicer little bag when I show up. So I'm not just coming and boiling water and spreading some herbs. I do have some of those too, but I'm coming as a clinically trained medical provider. And each state varies on licensure and access to drugs and things like that. Midwifery care is rooted in autonomy and choice. I will always offer the standard of care deemed by some governing body, like the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. However, I also will see my client vocalize what is truly evidence-based versus what is just a policy, because those two things don't often align, especially in healthcare, and give them individualized care if they choose to decline something that is a standard procedure. Where in a hospital setting, they often are overwhelmed by too many clientele in comparison to my smaller load, where they can't truly offer that type of individualized care and keep everyone safe. It's actually quite hard to do in their defense, but as a midwife, I take a smaller load. I can actually offer you a lot more choice and autonomy in every one of your procedures and throughout your care. And then I already said this, we work in collaboration with doulas and support persons, but I also consult with physicians when necessary. They serve an amazing place in our care system. We are just two different models of care, and we often collaborate to best support a client if they need a higher level of care. So a little bit more detail about what midwifery care includes. Prenatally, I'm usually seeing a person between 13 and 15 times in their pregnancy if they start from the beginning of their pregnancy. Many people don't know that they want midwifery care until they've experienced obstetrical care, and often decide that that does not feel good for them in the pregnancy and the birth experiences that they're wanting. So oftentimes people are starting care in the middle of their pregnancy, typically around 20 to 24 weeks pregnant. And that's not too late at all. Ideally, we want people to start earlier so that we can have time for these educational prenatals. We have time to address nutrition and dietary issues and assess how much are they active in their lives, and really prevent a lot of the things that can come up and contribute to our increasing mortality rate just by diet and exercise. So starting care earlier is helpful for the overall experience, but not necessary. Within those prenatal visits, it's about 45 minutes to an hour long. If you've been pregnant and gone through the traditional obstetrical model, you know that your appointments typically, you wait for about an hour, you see somebody for about 10 minutes. In my appointments, we see each other for about 45 minutes to an hour. 30 minutes of that is questions, anything that's coming up for you, or me providing educational material for where you are in your pregnancy. And then 15 minutes to 30 minutes is assessing baby, assessing the birthing person's vitals, explaining what labs we're doing and why, doing your labs, and any other procedures necessary for the visit. In all of this, there's a lot of shared decision-making. A lot of people talk about informed consent, which technically has a legal standpoint behind it. It's often not enforced, but informed consent is usually the provider offering all aspects of the benefit, the risk, alternatives to any procedure offered. It is not usually lived out in that way, but the decision should fall on the birthing person legally. If you've given birth or had any procedure in any aspect of healthcare, that is not usually what that looks like. The dichotomy between patient and provider really doesn't even allow for a true informed consent. In my practice, I explain what informed consent looks like. I give out papers of informed consent. They have to read them, they have to sign them so that I know they've read them. But before they even get that, we talk through what I describe as shared decision making, meaning it's not just going to be me making a decision or just them making a decision, but any aspect of just their cultural background, their doula maybe have an input on a procedure, myself and where my comfort zone lies as a medical provider, where they are kind of leaning just intuitively, or do they need more information? How are partners feeling? Because they may have more anxieties around some things, but not feel comfortable sharing because it's not their bodies. All of those players, all of these different factors play into decision-making as a new parent when you're not sure. So considering all those things, we talk extensively about shared decision-making prenatally, and in all of our visits, even in the postpartum period. So a lot of time goes into our prenatal care to improve outcomes. And we see it time and time again. Every study out there shows that midwifery care improves birthing outcomes, whether it's out of hospital, home, birth center, or in hospital. Even in hospital with OBs down the hallway, midwifery care outcomes are significantly better than obstetrical care. With the afterbirth, not the afterbirth because it has a whole different connotation right now. After the birth, the postpartum visits, offer just compassionate postpartum visits. One thing is different is we offer more postpartum visits. So most obstetrical care is going to include 1, maybe 2 postpartum visits if you have a cesarean birth. With my care, I will see my clients typically 4 times in the first 6 weeks in comparison to just that 1 time. I see them at 24 hours, 1 week, 3 weeks, 6 weeks. We have space to actually talk through lactation and infant feeding. We know that the hardest part of getting off to a good start with breast or chest feeding is that first week. So I see you twice to make sure that you and baby are thriving. I offer empowering resources. I have packets, and I've gotten to know you well enough to know what areas in the postpartum period are you worried about, which areas are there gaps that need to be filled based off your partner's work schedule, things you've localized in the pregnancy, and things I've just observed because I've built rapport with you and gotten to know you over this pregnancy. Talk through holistic healing from physical healing, but Malika alluded to this and I just jogged my memory. Storytelling at postpartum visit 3, the only agenda that for that visit is to talk about the birth, to review the birth, to have the birthing person tell me in their own words what that experience was like for them. We don't do it on the first or second visit because it's quite raw. We don't do it on the sixth visit, on the last visit of 6 weeks, just because we don't want to spend all of our time there, especially as we're closing out the care. But we do spend time and create space for the narrative that the birthing person has around their own experience. And I try not to color that, but it's helpful to hear and to offer any insight if they do have questions around their birthing experience. From a harm reduction standpoint, why let them be haunted by the what ifs? Is this necessary? Did they have to go this way? Will that happen the next birth? When I could just clarify things during this healing space. And then obviously we take care of the little babies and offer newborn care, normalizing what is expected. Newborns are very weird, cute creatures, but very weird medically. Their transition process from being in utero to out takes a while. And so their breathing is irregular, which can be very scary to new parents. So we talk about what's normal for them, offer education, offer tons of handouts. And then I'm obviously weighing them and assessing their growth to make sure that they're thriving and keeping them safe. All of that sounds great. However, there are not a ton of midwives in our country. Megan talked about our history in this country and why that is. Midwives were very much pushed out of the spotlight regarding maternal care. And since then, many barriers have been put up to make the pathway to being a midwife just harder to obtain. Someone who asked this question, I think I saw, are midwives nurses? So there are two types of midwifery credentials in our country. There's a certified nurse midwife. So yes, they do have a nursing background, and then they get essentially a master's in midwifery. And then there's a certified professional midwife, which does not have a nursing background, and they only have a degree or certification in midwifery care. So depending on which state you live in, sometimes, but like California accepts both options. And then North Carolina, which is where I'm from, only currently accepts the certified nurse midwife license. So every state is different. Yeah. Schooling, midwifery training is very expensive, ranging from anywhere from $20,000 to probably upwards past $90,000. This is cost prohibitive, especially if you already have a bachelor's and you're not trying to add to debt. Most people don't know they want to be a midwife coming out of undergrad because, as Malika alluded to, most of us don't know much about our anatomy, let alone childbirth, or even this as an option because it's considered kind of counterculture now. And so many people who might be pre-med are thinking they're going to medical school, and then they end up doing what I did and go to midwifery school. So they already have the debt of undergrad and potentially grad school as well. This also does include books and resources. So for my own degree, I had to pay a preceptor out of pocket in addition to paying my school. So I have to pay someone to train me every month. So it's not set up for everyone. Luckily, I had the income because I worked, but if I worked full time, I also wouldn't have been able to attend births. So it's really not set up to allow people to thrive during the schooling. I happen to not have children and to be single, which turned out to be huge benefits to get through the schooling. But if you are a parent and trying to do this, it is hard to have someone who's understanding of that lifestyle and obligations, and then also have childcare to get out of their bed at 3 a.m. That's kind of a lot. Schooling ranges from 3 to 7 years, depending on which route you take. And then, as mentioned, barriers include accessibility, costs, less representation among staff. Like, I had no preceptors of color, let alone no Black preceptors, and less accommodations for other life obligations and or being a parent, and less accessibility for marginalized communities. Slide, please. I think this is Malika.
Yes, thank you.
Mhm.
Just to synthesize all of this and to bring it all together, what opportunities are there for us to advocate for doula care and midwifery care to support birthing people of color? From the policy perspective, it's about insurance coverage for birth and postpartum support. Sometimes midwifery care that's not nurse midwifery care in a hospital isn't covered by insurance. Sometimes doula work, oftentimes doula work, both birth and postpartum, is not covered by insurance, let alone considering whether or not someone is on Medicaid. That's often a gap in service as well. We don't want, these services should not be cost prohibitive to individuals. Everyone should have equal and fair access to both doulas and midwives. So if you're in a position to provide advocacy, also considering postpartum in-home support for a minimum of 3 months of care as a standard for every birthing individual. That's often, like I said, a very tender and vulnerable time for postpartum healing. So to make sure people have support, having postpartum doulas as the standard of care would go a long way. And then increased accessibility to and ability to pay for doulas, especially in at-risk communities, as I already mentioned. Doulas should not just be for the affluent middle-class American. Doulas should be, and midwives should be, for all birthing people. Next slide. And then just a few of my favorite resources about doula care and comprehensive care models. Doula Trainings International provides training to doulas across the country as well as online. The Birthwell and Wild Ginger Herbal Center are both local to the DC metro area, but they both provide birth training. If you're looking to find doulas, Doula Trainings International has a doula locator tool on their website. System Midwives specifically lists doulas and midwives of color. And then Doula Match has a pretty comprehensive listing of doulas across the country. For more information about comprehensive care models that highlight the benefit of birthing support, social support, as well as midwifery care, you can look into Mama Toto Village Incorporated, the JJ Way, Jenny Joseph's body of work, or Common Sense Childbirth. And then Evidence-Based Birth is a great resource for evidence-based research about birth.
Thanks, Malika. So segueing into how all of this ties into the effects that interpersonal violence can have on maternal health, and then how doulas and midwives can, and other advocates can contribute to reducing some of these things. So in addition to experiencing racism and bias within care, people experiencing interpersonal violence have added risk into their maternal health. So less likely to receive consistent health care, including well-person exams, prenatal care, and postpartum care. So just physically making it and being able to assess the well-being of the birthing person and the baby is harder to accomplish. Around 23% of pregnant people will experience interpersonal violence during the pregnancy. So physical well-being being compromised during pregnancy. And then people who experience interpersonal violence, it also contributes to just adverse pregnancy and birth outcomes. So higher cesarean rates, higher incidence of arrest of labor, higher incidence of preterm birth, and lower infant birth weight. So the last two contribute largely to experiencing stress during the pregnancy, and that leading to baby not getting everything they need to grow and thrive because the birthing person is not getting everything they need to thrive, whether that's a physical experience or a mental, emotional, and spiritual experience. And then the first two sorry about that. The first two is affected by something Malika said earlier. She talked about how doulas will contribute to the physical space and the emotional space of the birthing person, like dimming the lights and making sure they feel seen, and the elimination of fear. Trauma, whether it's current or past, can definitely still surface in birth. There's tons of research, tons of experience, and if you ask any birth worker who's experienced this, we see it often just anecdotally, how that physical experience surfaces during such a raw, emotional, heightened state. So with that fear and tension, we see arrest of labor, meaning lack of progression, so not dilating fully and opening up to actually let baby out. And that leads to a need for interventions like Pitocin or vacuums to actually deliver the baby for the birthing person, or cesarean rate, because they typically don't progress enough to actually get baby out, because they're fearful, and they don't feel like this environment is safe to actually let their baby out. And they're mammals, and if they're scared and it's not a safe place for their little ones, they literally hold them in. And so we see a higher incidence of needing those interventions. Slide.
Thank you so much, Jessica and Malika. I think it's been incredible to hear about your experiences and a little bit more clarification about your roles, and really making this connection to why it's so important to make sure that folks that have experienced domestic violence have access to doula services and midwifery services. And today we really want to encourage folks in the domestic and sexual violence field to make those connections. So it's important to know that, you know, if you're with your little DV program or you work for a community health center, like, you are not in this alone. Our ask and our expectation is not that, you know, you're going to take on all of this, but really to think about how you can build those partnerships. And it's such a natural partnership. You know, when I listen to Malika and Jessica talk about their deep understanding of the impacts of trauma, the importance of creating an environment where birthing people feel empowered and know what their choices are, and, you know, advocates in a different way than a domestic violence advocate, but still, you know, seeing that same, valuing that service and that role. So I think the partnerships can come naturally, with a little bit of legwork, obviously, in your community. So a couple of models that we've seen, one, domestic violence advocates trained as doulas. So in your program, do you have folks that might be able to have the domestic violence program pay for someone to go through a certification process and be available to any pregnant survivors that you have receiving services? We've worked with programs, you know, all over the country where sometimes it's a matter of someone who's already trained as an advocate or someone who's already trained to be a doula happens to then come and work at a domestic violence program. And then that kind of expands everyone's thinking about how, you know, this is a great value add to provide survivors who are pregnant. We've also seen successes with domestic violence programs partnering with doula and midwifery programs. So for example, if you connect with one of the doula training programs, maybe that Malika mentioned or something similar in your community, new doulas have to attend a certain number of births as volunteers. So there's an opportunity to have a no-cost doula for folks that are in your program. And similarly with midwives who are in training, you know, always looking for opportunities to connect with community members. Of course, I want all midwives and doulas to be paid a living wage. We also know that many midwives and doulas provide sliding scales and pro bono services. It really depends. And so again, making connections, doing a little bit of research of what's available in your community and seeing who might be good partners there. Also, we've seen around the country kind of the growth of some community-based doula programs where it's basically a nonprofit that trains community members to be doulas and kind of go out into the community. It's like a home visitation model, really. And think about what, as a domestic violence program, you might be able to share. So some of the information and some training on this intersection between intimate partner violence, racism, and these health outcomes. We can be those connectors to help other folks better understand the experiences of birthing people who may have experienced violence themselves, and why it would be important to make sure that they have access to doula and midwifery care. Here in California, and I saw that we had a couple of folks from California programs, both in health settings and in domestic violence settings. One example which I think is exciting is this perinatal equity initiative, where counties in California that have Black infant health programs, so you have to have a certain percentage of Black birthing people in your county, are testing out different strategies to help reduce maternal mortality. And obviously one of the strategies is doula care and midwifery training and care. So if you live in California in a county that has a Black infant health program, I encourage you to look up, what opportunities there are to see how you can connect. And if you're in a different state, I also just encourage you to take a look at the California Department of Health page to learn about this perinatal equity initiative, and perhaps it's something you might be able to start, planting those seeds in your own state. So, we've talked about some strategies that are very kind of one-on-one or smaller community focused, and we want to think about those bigger systems issues that really contribute to all of these disproportionate outcomes. I also just wanted to take a second to mention Ujima is engaged in some faith-based strategies. Like, really, we got to think outside the box here. Where are pregnant people? Where are people that have experienced domestic violence, and really meet them where they're at, right? So thinking about Black churches or mosques, synagogues, like, where can we find natural groupings of Black pregnant people and make sure that they have access, again, to this information and these supports. So we're going to have, next slide. I thought I could advance it. So I would love to see in the chat if you have ideas for other strategies that your program has implemented to address Black maternal health. We don't have all the answers. And again, we're really excited to see what you all have to contribute, what's happening in your communities. We're going to take a couple seconds. While we're waiting, Jessica, Malika, or Megan, if you had anything else that you wanted to jump in with. Maybe the other presentation sparked an idea.
I just had a quick idea kind of around this question too, but from a harm reduction standpoint, and not to hyper focus on the experience of being a person who's experiencing interpersonal violence, but as we're talking through like birth experience, like kind of not, if you're taking it in as an advocate, not so much honing in on those stats that I listed of how it can affect their birth, but really trying to think outside of the box to create space for healing and processing, and bring peace and promote comfort and a sense of safety. So I think as advocates, and even as a midwife, knowing that someone has experienced this type of trauma, I want to be aware of how it can affect, but I also don't want to label their birth before it happens. And so I think as we move into the space as advocates, as doulas, as midwives, as people who want to help from a harm reduction standpoint, not so much harping and creating the narrative around their birthing experience before it happens. And so being aware, and that awareness leading to how can we create spaces of peace and comfort and a sense of safety, and quite frankly, asking them. They're going to really be the experts on their own techniques, really. So just crossed in my mind, thought about strategies.
And I think that, this environment of safety and peace certainly it benefits everyone, right? And so because we know that so many people in their lives experience domestic and sexual violence, and kind of keeping that in I would say the back of our minds, but really in the forefront, we don't necessarily need to ask people to really disclose their experiences and share their stories, because we know for a variety of reasons, people may not feel comfortable doing that. It's not the right space. And so if we go in and just try to create this comforting birth experience for everyone, we will catch other folks that have those experiences of trauma in their past, or possibly in their present as well.
And in addition to that, I think it's important that we're also creating spaces for shared experiences. So a lot of times the voices that we hear the loudest about birth are the people who have experienced trauma, right? But that doesn't mean that that's what all birth needs to be like. I think oftentimes the ones who experience trauma don't have a space where they can go and process. So the only thing they can do is to, warn other people essentially on blogs and in the way that they talk to expectant parents, which then perpetuates that cycle of fear about birth. Instead, if we had more constructive spaces where parents can come and process their experiences of birth together, both the positive and the negative, it can sometimes address the traumas that are experienced, normalize some other experiences, and just create space for more positive interactions and more positive narratives about birth to exist.
Thank you. All right, so we are going to move to the next slide. We're almost at the Q&A section. I did want to just share some national resources. And again, we're gonna send the slides out so you'll have access to all of this information. Really some of the big players here in the US that have been thinking about ways that we can work to reduce maternal mortality in the Black community. The Black Mamas Matter Alliance, Black Women's Blueprint, which Megan lifted up their report earlier, Black Women Birthing Justice, which is actually a Bay Area group, the National Perinatal Task Force, and then the two sponsoring organizations, Futures Without Violence, which I am from, and Ujima Incorporated, the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black community that Megan is a part of. And then I just have a screenshot here. Futures actually last year, or the year before, created this short fact sheet on the intersection of domestic violence, maternal mortality, and racism that might be a nice resource, especially as you think about, entering into these conversations at your programs, or, trying to figure out who natural partners might be, bringing a couple of resources that really lay out why these issues really matter and how they intersect. All right, we're going to move to the next slide. And if there are any other resources that you're aware of, please do enter them into the chat. And with that, we are going to do some questions and answers. I will lift one up right now that I saw. Uh-oh. My screen's mad. Okay, here we are. One question is this, and I think it's for Malika and Jessica. Typically, how's the relationship established between the doula or midwife and the birthing person's partner? I can imagine it might be threatening to the partner who might want to provide supports that you've discussed.
I think I'm going to just take a stab at this first, Jessica. I think oftentimes it's not so much the partner that's worried about the midwife, but often it's the partner worried about the doula and how involvement with the doula will impact their involvement in the birth. As I mentioned before, doulas are not there to replace anyone that the birthing person is inviting to their team, whether that's a partner or a parent or a friend, whatever loved ones are being invited to support them in the birthing space. The doula's job is not to replace any of them, but instead we work to enhance their participation in the labor. A lot of times the support people that are invited that are friends and family, maybe this is their first experience with birth, or maybe they birthed 30 years ago. The doula is helping them find their fit in the birth room, often educating or guiding. This is how you touch the person, or this is what you should say right now. This is a question that they may need to be asked. And then sometimes it's all hands on deck. Everyone needs to be doing something. I've got a hip squeeze, you've got a shoulder rub, someone else has a cold or warm somewhere on the body, and it's all players helping out. So the doula is never there to replace or to serve above anyone else that may be invited from a friend or a family.
I would say, in addition to that, to get there, I would say a lot of this conversation happens prenatally. That's something
Yes.
that's unique to doulas and midwives, is that we spend a lot of time getting to know both everyone. As a midwife, if your mom is going to attend your birth, I want her to come to at least one prenatal so I can get to know her ahead of time. So no one's new. They know that they can lean on me for questions to normalize things. I always tell people, even when I was a doula, that I'm just as much your doula, your midwife, as I am the birthing person. So if you need to rub your back and to reassure you that this is normal, I often do it out of habit anyway, but I am there to normalize the experience for them and to comfort them and to enhance their role, just as Malika said. And it becomes a lot easier in the moment because we build rapport prenatally, where I have so many partners like look at me and be like, what you think? Before they even, voice their own opinion as parents. And so it tends to be an easy, pretty seamless relationship when we set that standard in the prenatal period.
Great. And Whitney, I believe you're fielding a couple of questions.
Yes. So one question we have is, are midwife services covered by insurance carriers?
No. Some PPOs will cover global obstetrical care, and that can lump in midwives. Depending on the state, depending on the insurance company, they may be pretty particular about what type of midwife they cover, what type of OB they cover. So CPMs, which is my license, is least likely to be covered. CNMs, typically in a hospital, is the most likely to be covered, and then a CNM in a birth center home is the second. So that's a huge barrier because it really reduces, again, from the historical standpoint that Megan brought to our attention, the type of licensure, the type of education that you have to have becomes hierarchical from some institutional person who created it. It makes no sense, but it really does trickle down to access to all people, because now they've input these hierarchies and people aren't able to be covered, and thus people aren't able to afford midwifery care.
Great, thank you. So 2 questions related to birthing people who may be experiencing violence. Off the first one, how do doulas or midwives respond if they get a sense of imbalance in power in the home? Statistically, pregnant victims are at greater risk of domestic violence.
Yes. There is never one answer or one way to address this. It really depends on the circumstances. First and foremost, as a doula, I'm trying my best not to put myself in any situation that puts me in danger. And that means in how I'm managing the dynamics of the family that I'm working with, right? So if I do notice something, I'm checking in with my client as much as possible. When I say client in this instance, I mean the birthing person, about their safety. If we are in, if it is in a prenatal meeting, there's a lot of prenatal check-ins that I do with a birthing individual that it's just me and them. And then there are some that involves, the partners and other family members. So we do have some alone time where we can check in about safety and share resources if necessary. I also, as the doula, am aware of the limits of my practice. So I am not the resource, but I will connect you to the resource that can help you to address what's happening if you are ready to address it. That's the other part. And then the other thing that I do in the birthing space with regards to power dynamics, I am always amplifying the birthing person. I always say that they are the boss and they are never wrong in this instance. Throughout pregnancy and birth, what they say goes, and it is my job to uphold that. Yeah.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think often you can feel those power dynamics in the consultation or interview. So that's always kind of a red flag in, the back of my mind. One of the precautions I have in my midwifery practice is their electronic medical records has a space where they can answer questions, and often they are filling that out alone. Ideally, it's one of those things where I won't know because they're doing it at home, but it can be done on their phone or on their computer. And so when they're filling out their medical history, because the way it is kind of integrated in it, it's like they're filling out their diet and their weight, and often a partner isn't going to be monitoring that. And then it's down at the very bottom where it asks a series of questions around those power dynamics and if they feel safe and if they've had a history. It gives them the options to click history of current, and if there's things they don't want me to discuss with the partner present. So that's one screening tool. Other things I would say, I echo Malika, I express explicitly in front of everyone that the birthing person, I often say it from a legal standpoint, so it is not triggering for the partner too, that legally I have to hear it from the birthing person around consent. All of the documents have that person's signature on it and only that person, so it reduces a lot of those power dynamics in its own right. And I'm trying to think of other little things. I've had a couple experiences when I was at a high volume birth center where we asked that everyone left a room and, just pull the birthing person aside and, not explicitly ask, but just ask for them to talk, because we had a situation where only the partner was speaking for an extensive amount of prenatals, and we hadn't even heard her voice. And so it really depends. It's case by case. It's obviously a lot of intuition, a lot of interpersonal skills, and just kind of gut checks. If I am going to go there, I'm not going to do it alone. I typically will have a midwife assistant or some other person as a witness to be present, just to have those powers of numbers. And so if we're ready to go there, we will, but oftentimes I think the intimacy of midwifery care is intimidating for that power dynamic in itself. You can't hide, not from the birthing person's perspective, but the partner is often on display. And so I think in itself, it kind of sheds some light, or they don't feel safe and don't feel comfortable giving birth with midwives. They need to be in a system where they can kind of get in and out, which is unfortunate.
Mm-hmm. And Jessica, you talked or you touched on this, but I don't know if you have anything else to add, or maybe Malika. There's a question about, do you directly screen for intimate partner violence? What are your practices around screening?
My only screening, I think it's like 5 questions within the initial intake of their medical history. And it asks, I can't even think of the 5 questions, but have they experienced any past sexual trauma? Do they feel comfortable in their home? Have they experienced physical trauma by a partner? And I think it's 2 other things. And then, do they feel comfortable sharing information in front of their partner? And so it gives them a space, and then it doesn't pop up in their chart. The way in which the system is made, it doesn't auto-populate in the chart if the partner wants to access it once they've answered. And
then for me as the doula, so I am not asking questions about sexual health history because that's outside of my scope of care, but I do ask questions about safety. Do you have a general feeling of safety in your home? Do you feel safe in the place that you've chosen for birth? And that's the beginnings of how I screen.
Great, thank you. And I believe Megan was going to hop on for.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure. I just wanted to make sure that we just pop back over to the policy piece just a little bit before we wrap up in a few minutes. Folks, in the event that you have the opportunity to advocate for policy around evidence-based bias trainings, any kind of fair wages for birth workers or training around birth workers that lend itself even very specifically to access and the types and who will be able to garner these trainings and participate and use this as a livelihood, we certainly would encourage you to do so. You folks are out in the field working with families, the types of concerns and issues that they're having, that they are reporting to you. And so we want to make sure that you will do as much as you can by way of advocating for policies that lend itself to these types of initiatives as we know how important they are.
Great, thank you. Moving back up the chat, I also see there was a question about how you balance, how do you balance having multiple clients who are due at the same time?
I can start from the doula perspective. So one, my practice is small. I'm an individual and I am the sole practitioner in my practice. So I limit the number of people that I take on in a given month. And even if I'm taking on 2 people with the same due date, the probability of them going into labor at the same time is very, very small. In my 12, almost 13-year career, I've only twice had the occasion that 2 people were in labor at the same time. And both times it was the same individual who was laboring early. And both times I was able to address that I work with backup doulas. So other doulas that I partner with in the community who have very similar styles to me. I don't invite anyone to be a backup doula that I wouldn't invite to my own personal birth, because I know that clients are hiring me because they like my philosophy on birth. They like how I feel when we're together, that kind of thing. So I'm trying to invite other doulas to be my backup that have the same energy as that.
All the same things as a midwife. It's very rare. I too have only missed 2 births due to another birth, and I take 3 clients a month, and all 3 of my clients were in labor both times. And I made it to 2 of the births, and by the 3rd birth, I was no good. So it was just a matter of, I'm not going to be the person you hire because I'm exhausted. So let's send in my backup, who are amazing. And just being a professional birth worker, you have to have your own sense of boundaries and your own support team. And so that looks like my backup folks. The second time we had an earthquake here, and all the kids just decided to come out. And so it was a crazy day, and the parents understood. And so it was fine. But we tend to work with smaller caseloads so that we don't have that. And babies take their turn. They just do.
Mm-hmm. And I'm just going to do a special shout out to Jessica, who actually just came back from attending a birth. So we know that she's very even after a sleepless night, I mean, just an incredible presenter and thinker, and yeah.
Thank
so
you.
I can only imagine
running on adrenaline.
Those 2 births in a row. So we have another question, which we may need to get back to this person separately if you're not sure, but this one says, is there any correlation between birthing people contracting congenital syphilis and violence? Is it possible that they are kept from receiving prenatal care? And I think this is speaking a little bit to just what we know about people that are experiencing violence being more at risk for their partners transmitting STIs.
Yeah, I would say just from that standpoint, not specific to syphilis, but all STIs. Yes, people are at more risk if there is suspected interpersonal violence. Then as a provider, I would screen that person a few times in pregnancy when they're typically, obviously with their consent, when they're typically only screened at the very beginning of pregnancy. It doesn't remove them from care. Even as a midwife, it doesn't risk them out of care. It will just be some precautions taking place to get them treated before the delivery.
Great, thank you. So I did advance the slide to the contact information just so we don't forget, but we do have a couple more minutes, and Whitney has some questions that were shared on YouTube.
Okay, so one question was, if you are screening, should you also let them know if you're a mandated reporter, if you're asking about safety?
If you are a mandated reporter, then yes. It would be unethical not to disclose that.
Yes.
Okay, and I believe that is it from YouTube.
Okay, great. Any other questions from the peanut gallery? I'm going to give it a second to see if folks are typing.
While we wait, I just want to say thank you to both Ujima and to Futures for pulling this together. It's so important that we continue to publicly have these conversations and create space for people to learn more about supporting marginalized communities. So thank you so much for keeping this relevant work at the forefront.
Yeah, so well said, Malika. I'm just going to tell her thank you.
It's been my pleasure.
So I will
This is
just
Megan Simmons with,
Go ahead.
This is Megan Simmons with Ujima, the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black Community. It was my pleasure working on this presentation with these amazing folks and great thought leaders. Thanks so much for Futures for being willing to partner. And I hope thank you all for attending, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Yes, again, just lots of appreciation to our presenters and to Megan and Ujima for partnering with Futures on this. It's been such a gift and a learning experience putting this together, and hopefully it's just the beginning of lots of conversation at the community level and also at that kind of larger policy and systems change level as well. So with that, we can sign off. Everyone enjoy the rest of your day. And we'll make the slides available to everyone that was registered.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone. Take care.
Take care.
Thanks, folks. Take care.